Hey everybody, how you doing? Today we are talking about extra electoral participation, which contrasted with last week's discussion of turnout, actually I think is a very important topic for this sort of current era of politics, a very important topic no matter when you're thinking about politics, because we want to know, as scholars of political behavior, what compels people to go outside of the regular institutions of the ballot box, to have their voice be heard in the streets, in all sorts of different sort of protest participatory forms. And so again, just to briefly review what we talked about last time, in terms of turnout, we were discussing a wide variety of different theories that are designed to explain why some people are going to vote in elections, cast their ballots, and why other people are not. And going back to the earliest literature that we talked about in our group discussion a little bit, we described sort of formal rules and institutions. Of course, we're going to talk much more about that in a future class where we talk about electoral institutions and ballot access as kind of very important predictors of political participation. But beyond that, we also talked about this idea of rational costs and benefits. I think that it forms a very important kind of early approach to voter turnout. That literature really makes the case that there's a simple logic to voting that takes the form of V equals PB minus C. Essentially, the equation for voting that suggests that your propensity to turn out to vote is equal to the probability that you are, determinative in the election, the probability that you have this swing vote that changes the election, minus the costs associated with voting. And the general takeaway from that equation is that even though the cost of voting may be small, they're generally always larger than the potential benefits that one individual is going to gain from turning out to vote. And so this is essentially the paradox of voting behavior: is why would anybody vote if the costs were always larger than the benefit? And so if that's true, right, we know that a number of different costs exist for political participation, for voter turnout. Something as simple as getting transportation to the polling place, something as simple as taking off work, all the different costs that add up in a country that doesn't make Election Day a national holiday. And if those are large for people, then we could expect they aren't going to participate. But beyond that, some of the literature that came in after the fact, maybe in the 60s and 70s, made the case that there are a number of other different sort of psychological dimensions to this equation, adding in what we might call the D term, which is a catch-all in that equation, V equals PB minus C plus D, that helps to sort of explain why some people might actually turn out, despite the fact that it may be irrational according to the earlier logic. And these psychological predispositions can be everything from this sense of civic duty, right? This idea that it's something that, it's the minimal expectations for a democratic citizen, to a number of other feelings that, again, influence the way that we behave. And so, this psychological angle, I think, is a very important one, and we can't forget about it. It also is joined by this sort of VBS story that we talked about last time, the Verba-Brady-Schlossman story, about the idea that there are certain skills and sort of resources that individuals gain over the span of their sort of participation in civil society organizations, and that those skills, things like learning how to write a letter, learning how to, compose a political argument, learning how to interact with coworkers, that these kinds of skills build up and help people, determine whether or not voting makes sense to them. Maybe this is also one of the explanations why college graduates are much more likely to vote than non-college graduates. And so finally, the last sort of turnout-based thing that we talked about was this idea of group identities and how community empowerment might be especially important in fostering things like minority turnout in the United States today. But so having reviewed kind of all these different approaches to turnout, I think we can turn the page a little bit and think about how these specific theories relate to engagement beyond turnout. And so by that I'm talking about specifically protest and civic sort of engagement in terms of this extra electoral voice. And so again, I challenge you to think really carefully about these different approaches, right? What are the formal rules? I mean, certainly we can begin that discussion by thinking about the First Amendment and the idea that, jurisprudence over the years has increasingly enshrined protest participation as being a very valuable and important part of our, right to speech plus, essentially. But beyond those formal rules, we can think about the costs and benefits associated with actual turnout behavior. And in this sense, maybe a rational choice approach has a lot to tell us. More on that in a moment. Psychologically, obviously, that's going to be a very important set of predictors of turnout in protest waves. What are the feelings? What are the emotions? What are the cognitions that are leading people to, again, leave their homes and take to the streets? Very important set of questions there. But beyond that, again, going back to VBS and this idea of civic skills and resources, right? And especially the idea that civil society organizations might have a very important role to play here. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about group identities as being very valuable, as well as ways to understand why people might turn out in protests beyond just the ballot box. And so first, turning to some of these sort of more structural explanations, we want to go back to the earlier literature on the subject and think about two kind of important principles, that is, grievances and political efficacy. And so the grievance stuff, the grievance literature has been around for a very long time. And a few sort of key concepts that emerge from this theory, first of all, is this idea of relative deprivation, which is essentially what happens when one group identifies that they are getting the short end of the stick relative to other groups in a society. And that's essentially, according to this theory, going to spur some kind of vocal reaction, some kind of public outcry that may or may not take the form of a protest as we know it. And so going all the way back to medieval times, we can sort of chart moments when certain groups felt relative deprivation and made their voices heard. I think one salient example here that we could think about is the Boston Tea Party, right? No taxation without representation is essentially an argument, right, about distributive justice, basically this idea that people are not being treated fairly, and as a result, they're losing out relative to British subjects back, in the home country. And as a result, we see that the tea gets dumped in the harbor, and eventually the United States declares independence. And so, of course, protest has been a very important part of our history going back to the beginning. I want to sort of distinguish between these two kinds of pieces here of distributive and procedural justice, right? Distributive justice is essentially this idea that people will get upset when they feel like they're not getting a fair outcome, basically. When outcomes are not fair, they're looking around and they're saying, hey, group X over here is getting way more than group Y. I'm a member of group Y, and therefore I'm experiencing a feeling of grievance, of relative deprivation. But there's also this idea of procedural justice, which is to say, I don't feel like the rules, essentially, as applied, are fair. And so I'm looking around, I'm noticing that rules are not fair. And even though, right, maybe distributive problems haven't emerged yet, or maybe those distributive problems are hard to sort of see without some kind of massive data kind of story, right? Anecdotes are scarce. This procedural injustice is still going to mean that I sort of accumulate grievances against the system and will eventually lead to my protest participation. And kind of from a more emotional perspective, we can think about these two things combining to influence what we might call moral indignation. The idea that people say, look, this is just simply patently not fair, and therefore I feel this pent-up sense of frustration against the system. So grievances, I think, run through the literature all the way from this earliest work on just kind of the cost benefit and when groups are treated unfairly, all the way through to the emotional side of things. We also want to think about efficacy as an important piece of this puzzle. Internal efficacy essentially being how we feel about our role in the political process, how, whether we feel enfranchised, whether we feel, like we actually have a voice essentially in politics. And external efficacy being our perceptions of the sort of legitimacy and the goodness of the political institutions that surround us. So external efficacy being especially important here, because if we look around and we see, hey, I don't think that I'm being represented here by any of the political agents in the system as it is, I'm going to try to put pressure to change that system. And so external efficacy is something that might be especially important in stimulating protest movements, even when relative deprivation is not as clear-cut at any given moment. So I think, again, the question that we need to consider here is not, oh, like when we see a protest, what's causing it? I think the question is to think about the counterfactual scenario, which is to say, why don't we sometimes see protest, whereas other times we do? What is it that makes this protest highly attended? What is it that stimulates and spurs people to come out to protest this specific issue relative to a different issue, maybe where we see very little protest or no protest at all? And so grievances and efficacy are two ways to help us, distinguish, to delineate between, classifications where there are strong protest waves and times and cases when there are not. But moving beyond that, we also have to think carefully about another form of, sort of protest mobilization stimulation, which comes from our identities. And so going back to this sort of seminal work of Teifel and Turner, we can think about social identity theory as being an incredibly important driver of protest behavior. And so I don't want to give you the whole rundown on social identity theory right now. That's a discussion that would probably take a lot longer than this video should be. But really, I want to focus in on just a few sort of core observations of social identity theory. The first core observation, and this is something that if we were in person, I would play around with a lot more, as you'll see in our group discussion. The first core observation is that we can create group identities almost instantly by making divisions between people. And those identities are going to start to become increasingly salient to our behavior almost immediately. So social identities can be developed through, any kind of sort of social discrimination. And by that, I don't mean like, a grievance or relative deprivation. I simply mean by a classification, a discriminatory assignment of some people to one group and other people to a different group, just an identification or a recognition of group difference. And wherever that happens, social identity theory is bound to predict that people are going to start to behave much differently. Their psychology is going to start to kick in, and we're going to start to see some of those baseline psychological principles that we discussed early in the semester, where people are going to start to use mental shortcuts to judge members of the in-group and out-group differently. In terms of social identity theory as it applies to protest, we know that social identities are going to be especially important for protest when these conditions sort of hold true, when group boundaries become increasingly impermeable. Because again, if you're experiencing a grievance, it's very possible in many cases for people to leave and join specific groups in order to essentially do away with some of those grievances. So if you're, for example, belonging to groups that have arbitrary joining characteristics, like say that I, just for the purposes of illustration, divided the class into two groups, Group A and Group B, and I gave Group A a whole bunch of resources for studying for the midterm, and I didn't give Group B any of those things. And I said, you are free to join Group A or Group B. What's going to happen is eventually the whole class will be in Group A because you get all the resources. And Group B, nobody will want to be part of Group B. Nobody will want to call themselves a member of Group B unless maybe there's some kind of masochist and they want to tough it out without any resources. But those are fluid, permeable group boundaries. When it comes to things like race, and in many cases class and other kinds of like foundational political distinctions in American politics and politics far beyond our shores, those group boundaries can become quite impermeable, where it's, you cannot leave that classification willingly. And so that's where grievances are going to back people into corners. We also have, of course, this idea of status stability, right? Like you can't, the group boundaries are fixed. You can't join or leave. And increasingly, we see evidence that over time, that group is going to be sort of treated unfairly without any change in their status. So it's not like the groups, one day one group's on top, one day the other group's on the bottom, right? It's really this idea that Group A is always getting the resources every single day of the semester, and never does that change. And then finally, right, this idea of perceptions of illegitimacy, right? Can we look at this sort of structure and say to ourselves, hey, Group A is illegitimately claiming all the resources. Here in Group B, we're not getting our fair share, and essentially the existence of this social stratification is indicated by illegitimate sort of rules. So this altogether is going to mean that social identities, obviously, they exist everywhere. We call ourselves Ravens fans. We call ourselves whatever, like Arsenal fans. All these social identities overlapping and existing constantly. Like I call myself a professor, I call myself a cat aficionado, right? But none of those things are going to cause me to develop grievances that lead to protest. But some of my group statuses that have these characteristics are the ones that might actually lead to protest. Finally, social identity theory and collective identity also tell us a little bit about the idea of intergroup solidarity, which is the idea that even though you may not belong to group B in our group simulation kind of example, where you're getting screwed by not getting all of the resources you need to complete the midterm, members of group A could appeal to me and say, "Hey, professor, what the heck? Why are you not giving group B all the resources?" And you might engage in some sort of intergroup solidarity where you come across and say, "I'm an ally of group B. I want to help group B. I don't think that this system is fair or just." And so that's one of the reasons why you also might participate, despite the fact that you're not experiencing the grievance for yourself. So social identity theory and collective identities go beyond just ascribing to those group statuses. We might also have the idea that groups could reach across different sort of intersectional lines and assist each other with protest. Beyond that, we also have to think about other dimensions of psychology. For example, anger. Right? Anger is, I think, an incredibly important emotion for protest, and one that we'll expand upon a lot in our group discussion. But the last thing I want to talk about in terms of these different explanations is the idea of social capital and social embeddedness. And this, I think one of the most vocal kind of proponents of this idea of social capital is a guy named Robert Putnam, who wrote a book, actually several books over the years, but specifically a book that I think has captured the American imagination called Bowling Alone, which I think is a very interesting book. If you've never read it, you could check it out from the library or get a synopsis online. But essentially the crux of the argument that Putnam is making in this Bowling Alone book is that back in the day, in the 60s or the 50s, I guess, 50s, 60s, even the 70s, we had a lot of social embeddedness in America where most of the time people were participating in sports leagues, participating in civic clubs, participating in church community organizations. And most of the time when we were doing leisure activities, as Americans, we were going out of the home and we were getting together with other people and doing stuff with a common cause. So essentially, we were participating in civil society activities. And of course, his archetypical example of this is a bowling league, where lower middle class people can get together, they can drink a beer at the bowling alley, and they can high five each other and wear their bowling shirts and compete against each other in a friendly way on these bowling teams. And he says essentially that now today, right, we don't do that. We don't have these bowling leagues. We don't have nearly as much. Our civil society sort of fabric has eroded. And of course, part of the argument that makes Putnam's book a little bit controversial is that he essentially ascribes most of this erosion to the rise of television and the idea that we've replaced a lot of our leisure activities with just watching Netflix or whatever. Probably casting a blind eye to some of the ways in which we're doing a lot more like online interaction. But again, that book is in the 90s and is maybe not quite up to speed with some of those rapid changes to the social media environment, especially. But again, Bowling Alone is, I think, an emblematic example of what happens when we lack social embeddedness. If we do have strong social embeddedness, this is one of the ways in which we might classically typify examples where protest is quite likely. Because if you're in that bowling league and you're high-fiving each other and drinking your beer and rolling the bowling balls, and one person speaks up and says, "Hey, I've noticed that our maybe it's an employment-based thing, right? The people who work our shift at the factory, it seems like the foremen really ride us a lot harder than the second shift. Have you noticed that? We're way more productive than them, and yet we are constantly getting denied bonuses. We're constantly getting denied, breaks. That we only get one break per shift, and the other group is getting 3 breaks per shift. That doesn't seem to make sense. Clearly, there's favoritism going on. And before long, you'll see that those people are communicating enough to cause some kind of collective mobilization. Maybe that ultimately would eventually lead to things like unionization and strikes, for example, walking off the job, picket lines, and other forms of, again, extra electoral kind of political engagement. And so The lack of that is one explanation for why we don't see a tremendous amount of protest in American politics, according to this theory. But if we maybe fast forward to the present day, right? We can think about the idea that protest is quite likely actually today. We've got more people reporting, according to Pew surveys right now, participating in their first ever protest than almost any other time in American history. And so if we put this all together, we can think about this maybe dual process model of engagement. Model one, meaning that we've got a lot of structures and institutional kind of ideas, a rational choice perspective, perhaps, that helps to explain why we might develop grievances and express them. And then model two, having a lot more to do with social identity and the role of emotion, especially anger, in fueling protest across different group lines in terms of a lot of solidaristic protest participation. And together, I think all of these approaches are going to allow us to gain a more robust understanding of why people go out there in the street to protest beyond just the bowling alone explanation. So again, if we think about, this is from the headlines, here's a protest wave that was just 2 days ago in Baltimore, a protest after the sentencing, right, for the police officers involved in the killing of Breonna Taylor. Of course, here we have in 2017 the Women's March, which was truly, I think, one of the largest single acts of protest in the United States ever. There were actually, I don't know if you all remember this, but there were so many people who came to this march that literally it was impossible to get to Washington because these subway lines were so clogged. I know some people who attended this protest, and they said that ultimately by the end of the day they were able to arrive, and by that time the protest was dispersing. Here's a pro-life rally. These kinds of things happen, in front of the Supreme Court occasionally, right? There were a couple of these that were notable in recent times. And of course, in terms of other kinds of single issue marches, we've got a lot of climate marches right now as well happening in DC and elsewhere. So I think together, right, this set of theories really, again, I want to stress, doesn't just lead us to ask the question of when does protest happen, but also to ask the critical question of when does protest not happen. And if we take that question seriously, the counterfactual, right, what would the conditions be necessary for this to have not happened? And if we think about other kinds of issues, other kinds of political moments in American history today, right, the question is what causes this to happen now? What causes this to happen later? What causes this to happen never? And so if we take that seriously, I think that we arrive at a much more sophisticated understanding of protest participation in America today. Have a wonderful week. I look forward to our discussion on this subject, and I will see you all on Wednesday.